Alright. Ha? Maayong buntag, maayong udto, maayong hapon, or maayong gabi. Depende kung saan ni orasan ninyo tanawon ang video. Anyways, so I will be discussing Chapter 1, Introduction to Physiological Psychology. So, most of you might not be familiar with physiological psychology, but hopefully in this overview of the subject, you will get to understand no the flow of the semester for Psych 1203 physiological psychology. So let's start. Okay, so let's know the basics first. Now, what is physiopsych? What is physiological psychology, or sometimes called biopsychology? So physiopsych is the study of physiological, evolutionary, and developmental mechanisms of behavior. Uh, this means, class, that physiological psychology tries to situate certain biological processes within us, human beings, and relate it to how it affects certain behavioral processes that we have. No? Say, for example, how our eating affects our behavior later on in the day, how our sleep, how our learning mechanisms affect our performance in certain academic settings. In ana. So, physiological psychology is an integrative concept, no, which tries to inculcate several concepts or mechanisms of behavior and trying to integrate it into a more understandable concept, no? And at the same time relating it to psychological theories or concepts. Okay, the goal of physiopsych is to relate concepts of biology to psychology. This is what I told you a while ago. Your biological processes are biological processes as human beings, and relating it to how it might affect psychological concepts, for example. No? So, kung sa biology lang, if we look at biology, diba, later on in your second year, exposed mo to biology, biology will just look at the physical characteristics of certain animals, no? Sa mga parts, di ba? No? About mo biology, dissect mo frog, dissect mo iring, cat, tan-aw mo, sa man nga heart part, sa man nga artery, sa man nga bone, okay? But in physiological psychology, we go beyond that mechanism, no? We try to look at, for example, unsa nga brain part. No? Like say, for example, this is the cerebrum, okay? But what does the cerebrum do? No? How does the cerebrum affect our activity? Okay? Unsa may processes mahitabo sa cerebrum? Okay? So that is physiopsych. Okay? Okay, now, major themes. What are the different major themes, no, or the themes of biopsychology or physiological psychology? So, kaning major themes class are important because this is where our discussion throughout the SEM will revolve around, no, tungod ani nga mga integral concepts. So we start with the evolutionary perspective. So from the word itself, evolutionary perspective, uh, in physiopsych or biopsych, we look at the past. We look at the evolutionary history of human beings and how that affected certain processes that we have currently. Yeah. So, in the evolutionary perspective, environmental pressures that led to the evolution of our brains and behavior often leads to important biopsychological insights. Meaning, ang atong evolution as human beings, our evolution from the time that we were the Australopithecus, nahimo tang Homo habilis, nahimo tang hominid sa patong mga kwan until nga na Homo sapiens ta. Naa na siya contribution kung unsa atong current behavior, kung unsa ang current insights into our uh, cycle as human beings. Okay? So, important ang evolutionary perspective. Muna ginatawag class that we cannot leave the past behind. Tan-awon nato dito atong i-track nga numan nga currently in ani atong behavior maybe tungod na ay past history, di ba? Say for example, nga naman nga ang mga nga naman nga ang human beings na umbilical cord for example or kani atong belly button, no? Later on in the semester you will know that the belly button is an offshoot of our evolution as human beings. No? So mo nang important ang evolutionary perspective. Next, neuroplasticity. Kani medyo bag-o ni siya nga term sa inyo ha. So what does neuroplasticity mean? Okay? Neuroplasticity means that the brain, no, ang atong nervous system, the brain being the central part of it, is plastic. Okay? Dili ka ng plastic nga kanang may lang tubangan pero bati sa luyo. Plastic meaning the brain is a changeable organ. Meaning the brain is an organ that grows and changes in response to our experiences and our genes. Kuya, wanong plastic di ang brain. Pero dili ka ng plastic ha, nga kusog manglibak. Plastic nga kanang mo-adapt siya. Highly adaptable to new information. Muna class, no, if you go back to Psych 1, di ba natin automatic and controlled processes. Anong naa may automatic and controlled processes? Because the brain is neuroplastic. Some processes start as automatic, but it becomes controlled because the brain adapts those processes. No? So, inana, the discovery of neuroplasticity arguably was the single most influential discovery in modern neuroscience. Dako ko siyang impact. Kay sa una class, wala man kabaw ning mga scientist nato nga ang brain di ay ma-adapt. Nagtuo sila nga ang brain kung unsay sud mao na. Oh. Kung bright ka. Bugo ka. Mao ra. Mura yang huna-huna. Mura ilang thinking before. But they didn't realize nga there's something more to the brain than what they knew. So katong mga scientists na in the future, mga mas daghan sila equipment bod, mas daghan sila knowledge, no? Ila dayon na discover nga ay dili di ay, no? Kani dayong brain mo develop pag ni siya all throughout our existence. So even if say for example, you are academically slow at a certain point in time, later on, pwede di ay nga mo bloom ka in terms of your intelligence or your intellect. It's that the brain knows how to adapt and how to change based on your experience, based on circumstance. So in Ana. Next, clinical implications. Okay? So kaning physiological psychology is a big offshoot of abnormal psychology, which is in itself abnormal psychology, one of the uh, subfields in clinical psych. No, unsay pasabot aning clinical implications? Clinical pertaining to illness or treatment, clinical considerations are woven through the fabric of biopsychology. Nga naman class? Because there are some psychological nga mga disorders that can be attributed to certain biological processes. Genetics, number one. Pwede kayo. There are some psychological disorders, especially neurodevelopmental disorders that can be attributed to the genes of the person. Meaning, naa siya ani tungod kay a person in his or her family had this as well. That's clinical implications. No? In clinical implications, there are two aspects. Much of what biopsychologists learn about the functioning of the normal brain comes from studying the diseased or the damaged brain. No? It took years for them to study. Conversely, much of what biopsychologists discover has relevance for the treatment of such disorders. Naay relevance. Ilang gitun-an ang damaged brain, and because of that, they able to develop mechanisms to treat those disorders. Mo na nga ang mga psychological disorders karon ay mga therapy, na mga gitawag na tong mga different interventions that can be used to at least treat or alleviate the the different manifestations of those disorders. Dako kaayo contribution si biopsych or si physiopsych ana nga dynamic. So see, no? Physio ang name niya, no? Simple siya name, but it is very far-reaching class. Evolutionary perspective, naabot sa dihang dapita, naabot pagid siya sa neuroplasticity, hantod naabot lang sa clinical implications. Daghan siya gitawag na to og branches. Okay? And we will know more about that no in the next slide. Okay. Biopsychology and neuroscience. As I said in the first few slides, biopsych or physiopsych is a highly integrative discipline. Pasabot anang integrative class, ma-relate nimo ba? It can be related to other such disciplines. Biopsychology and abnormal psych, biopsychology and even counseling. Nga naman, kaya ang counseling, pwede man kadiha makadevelop og interventions. Okay? Or biopsychology and social psychology. Because in biopsych, we look at the biological origins of our behavior. No? And social psychology could be the field that makes sense of that dynamic. So daghan. Daghan kay siya mga, it's a far-reaching concept. And one of those concepts that can be highly integrated to biopsychology is neuroscience. In neuroscience, no, biopsychologists draw knowledge from neuroscientific disciplines and apply it to the study of behavior. Simple kay class, from the word neuroscience, it is definitely the study of mechanisms of our brain. Sa atong utok, atong nervous system. So what are the divisions of neuroscience? We have neurochemistry. No? It studies the chemical basis of neural activity. Tana mo, unsa man ang neural activity, sir? O, kana mga what causes action potentials, what causes the resting potentials. Because at first class, nagtuo ang mga scientists. Ano sila nga, brain activity is caused by electrical impulses, electrical charges. But later on, they realize nga, naa din mga chemical basis na ay mga chemicals po di ay that enables brain functioning. O na ginatawag na itong mga neurotransmitters. No, later on, i-discuss na muna parts in neurochemistry. Next, neuroendocrinology, the study of interactions between the nervous system and the endocrine system. So sa Psych 1, if nakaagi mo Psych 1, which I'm sure you have, sa neuroendocrinology, gi-discuss ang hormones. Because, nga naman, hormones are mainly produced by the endocrine system. But Dili si endocrine system ang nagsugo nga i-produce na. It's the nervous system that instructs the endocrine system to produce those hormones because of certain occurrences. Neuroendocrinology is another division. Next, neuropathology. Simple. Study of nervous system disorders. Some nervous system disorders are biologically linked. May it be genetics, may it be even environmental influences. Mao na nga part siya sa study because pwede man ma-attribute ang some nervous system disorders to certain biological processes. Next, neuropharmacology, the study of the effects of drugs on neural activity. Have you heard of the words antagonist drugs, agonist drugs? Oh. Sa physiopsych, yun nang madunggan later on. Antagonist drugs have a certain effect on the brain. Agonist drugs also have a certain effect on neural activity. Later on, inyo nang mahibawan. Okay? Neuropharmacology is the division of neuroscience that tackles the dynamic. Lastly, neurophysiology, the study of the functions and activities of the nervous system as it relates to biological processes. Okay? Neuro plus physio, nervous system plus biological processes. This neurophysiology is the bread and butter of physiopsych. Mo ni ang focus. Dili raman ta, di ba? Sa Psych 1, remember mo Psych 1? Mingon raman ta nga si cerebrum is the si frontal lobe is in charge for creativity, decision making, na that utob function. But in physiopsych, moingon ta nga si frontal lobe, decision making and creativity, but at the same time we try to understand nganong si frontal lobe man ang in charge ana. We also try to understand nga what if mawala si frontal lobe? Who takes over? Who supplements the activity of the frontal lobe if it is damaged? Physiopsych answers that. Okay? Finally, we are now in the last slide. Simple rang life, guys. Itataw man. Divisions of biopsych. Lahi ni ha. Neuroscience. This is now biopsych. Physio. Actual. Okay? First division, of course, physiological psychology. It is the division of biopsychology that studies the neural mechanisms of behavior through direct manipulation of brain in experiments. Bantay mo anak ka ng ibutang diri sa tong ulo ng mga connect ganig wire na anak diri. Mo na mga methods. Kaya nga naman tas tan-aw na. For example, imong gilihok imong right hand. Unsa man nga brain part ang brain structure ang ni-activate. Kaya kung na-activate to siya nga brain structure, meaning, o na siyang in charge sa movement sa imong right hand. Or, nagkaon ka. Kaon ka. Kaon ka, kuhan, butang tag. Mangga, imong gituslog hip. Nya kato na pod, tan-aw din sa screen, sa scan, unsa may in charge nga brain structure. Kaya nga naman, mura man na siya mo yellow plus. Murag mo, klaro nimo. Ana dayon mo sa physiopsych, no? Studies the neural mechanisms of behavior through the direct manipulation of brain in experiments. Okay? Next is psychopharmacology. Similar to physiological psych, except that it focuses on the manipulation of neural activity and behavior with drugs. Kaya kulbaan tani kay drugs man. Drugs, antagonist drugs, agonist drugs. We have to understand that certain drugs have certain effects. Depressants, stimulants, ingon kag stimulants, stimulate brain activity. Muna, some people who use stimulants experience certain highs, quote unquote. Anong highs man? Tanaw nila, kwan sila, kanang murag galutaw. Highs. Depressants, on the other hand, from the word itself, depresses, reduces brain activity due to drugs. Inom kag beer, tulo ka buok, red horse, ikaw rang usa ka inom. Barag ka, di ba? Automatic. Barag ka. Nga naman, ni-reduce yung activity, kaya na barag na ka. Imong movement, limited na. Imong panguna-huna, na altered na, taka lang kag yawit. Di ba? Taka lang kag pangihi. Ana na. Depressants. No? Next, neuropsychology. The study of the psychological effects of brain damage in human patients. Mao nang neuropsychology. Brain, for example, class, stroke, for example, timbak ko, no? Tawag na to. Naman duha ka types of stroke. Ischemic and kalimot ko sa isa. Ischemic. Ano na lang, mild stroke na lang. Igugay ta maguman. Mild stroke, for example. Diba, naman na yung ma-damage ng brain part. Kaya nga naman, nag-clot ang blood. Now, that's the physical effect. So, may physical effect sa mild stroke. Altered speech, slurry speech, kaya murag medyo kwan imong pagstorya, hiwi imong baba, ana. Or, depende kung unsa nga side sa brain ang naigo, mao po nga side sa body ang limited imong movement, etc. But, what takabaw na aday psychological effects? Of course, ikaw, liman ka ma-stroke, simbak ko ang isa ka tao, na ay certain psychological po damages. Kaya nga naman, some parts of the brain are actively involved in our psychological processes. Muna nga na effect kung na ay physical damage. Okay? Next, psychophysiology. It is the division of biopsychology that studies the relation between the physiological activity and psychological processes. Say, for example, so may example na ko. O, kani. Uh, have you, say, for example, physiological, yung physiological activity, say, for example, kana ganing ma-process ba sa atong mga main system? Physiological activity like running, dagan. Dagan ka, dagan. Okay? Kana ding running or any other physiological activity, nabod na siya psychological nga mga mechanisms that affects that. No? In fact, moana gani sila na mga certain studies on mental health that exercise helps a person improve his, mental and emotional state or emotional health rather. Kaya nga naman, naari na siya connection. Throughout the SEM, we will try to establish that. Lastly, cognitive neuroscience. Youngest division of psychology, but it is among the currently the most active and exciting. Nga naman, tungod sa iyang pagkabata, tungod kay pag-o pa yun siya, maupod siya ang gistadihan ron pag-ayo. Mo na diha magawas ang concept of learning, kaya magawas ang concept of short-term, long-term memory, STM, LPM. Diha magawas ang mga concepts of motivation. What motivates a person to behave this way, etc. Cognitive neuroscience. So, muna, we're done. Just a very short, brief introduction of physiopsych. Hopefully, throughout the SEM, we will be able to discuss and deliver this structural framework uh, that I have discussed in the introduction through specific chapters in biopsych or physiopsychology. Okay? So I hope that you learned something today. Thank you. Goodbye.